The day my son brought a buyer to my house and said, "Pack your things, you're going to a nursing home," he thought he had already won. What he didn't know was that I had already signed something years ago that would destroy his entire plan. The house on Clover Hill Road had been mine for 37 years, not just in the legal sense, not just as a name printed on paper, but in the way a life settles into walls and refuses to leave. Every corner held something of me, something of us. The kitchen still carried the faint memory of cinnamon and sugar from decades of birthday cakes. The screen door still snapped shut with that familiar rhythm of summers long gone. Every December, without fail, Christmas lights wrapped around the porch railing, Gerald's tradition, even in the years when his hands had begun to shake. We bought that house in 1987, a cream-colored colonial with green shutters and a yard big enough for everything we thought life would become. It was never just a purchase, it was a promise, and for many years it kept that promise. When Gerald passed in 2014, the house changed in a way I can't fully explain. It stopped being just a place to live and became something quieter, something heavier. It became the last place where he still existed. The third step on the staircase still creaked exactly the way it always had. The afternoon light still fell across the dining room at 4 o'clock like it was trying to remember him. I wasn't just living there anymore, I was preserving something, holding on to it in ways no one else could see. My son, Derek, never understood that. He had grown up in that house, yes, scraped his knees in the driveway, slammed doors, argued with his father, but he never saw it the way I did. To him, it was always something measurable, something with a price. Even as a teenager, he had that way about him, that habit of evaluating everything like it was part of a calculation. I used to tell myself it meant he was driven, that it was ambition. But after Gerald died, I began to understand it differently. It wasn't warmth pushing him forward, it was something colder. The calls began becoming more frequent about a year before everything happened. At first they sounded like concern. He'd ask about my knees, about the stairs, about whether I was managing everything on my own. Then, slowly, the word downsizing appeared. He used it so casually, like it was a neutral suggestion, like it didn't carry the weight of erasing a life piece by piece. I told him I was fine, because I was, but each time he said it, I felt something small and uneasy settle inside me. Then Tiffany began visiting more often, Derek's second wife. She had a way of smiling that looked kind at a distance, but never quite reached her eyes. She brought casseroles, complimented my curtains, and walked through my home like she was quietly taking inventory. Not openly, never rudely, but carefully, intentionally. I noticed, even when I told myself I was imagining it. "This place must be so hard to keep up," she said once, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table. I smiled and told her it wasn't. She smiled back, and in that moment there was something unspoken between us, something we both understood, but neither of us said out loud. The day everything changed was an October afternoon, the kind where the air feels thin and the earth smells like it's turning over for good. I was in the garden, pulling the last of the tomato stakes from the ground, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. It wasn't Derek's. I remember that immediately. A silver sedan, unfamiliar, out of place. I stood up slowly and looked toward the driveway as Derek stepped out of the car. He was wearing a blazer. That alone told me something wasn't right. Derek didn't dress like that to visit me, not ever. Then another man stepped out from the passenger side, mid-50s, clipboard in hand, the kind of posture that comes from walking through houses that don't belong to you. He glanced around the property with quick, practiced eyes, measuring without measuring. Derek smiled as he walked toward me, relaxed in a way that felt rehearsed. "Mum," he said, "this is Craig Ellinson. He's very interested in the property." The property. Not the house, not my home, the property. I stood there with dirt still on my hands, the wooden stake loose in my grip, and looked from the stranger to my son. The air had gone colder, or maybe it was just me. "I'm selling your house," he said, like he was announcing something already decided. "You're going to Meadowbrook. It's a great place. I've already looked into it. You'll like it." Meadowbrook. I knew exactly what that meant. A place where people were sent when they became inconvenient. A place where time slowed down until it disappeared completely. I didn't respond right away. I looked at him, really looked, at how easily the words had come out of his mouth, at how certain he was that this was his decision to make. Then I turned and looked at the house behind him, the green shutters, the porch railing, the window where the light would fall later that afternoon just like it always had. And something inside me didn't break. It settled. Not anger, not fear, something quieter, something steady. I set the garden stake down carefully, brushed the dirt from my hands, and walked past them into the house without another word. I could feel them following me, Derek confident, the other man more hesitant now. The papers were already on the kitchen table, prepared, neatly arranged, waiting. Of course they were. I picked them up and read slowly, line by line. A purchase agreement, authorization forms, documents designed to make everything look clean, official, final. Derek stood across from me, watching, completely certain of how this would end. He thought this was already done. I let my eyes move across every page, taking in every detail, every assumption he had made. And then, just for a second, I allowed myself the smallest smile. Not for him, he didn't notice. It was for me. Because 11 years ago, I had made a decision he had never bothered to ask about, a quiet decision, a careful one, the kind that doesn't matter until suddenly it matters more than anything. I picked up the pen, and I signed.
Derek exhaled the moment the pen left my hand. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I saw it. That small release of tension, like a man who believed he had just crossed the finish line. Craig Ellison, standing slightly behind him, adjusted his clipboard and glanced at the papers with a quiet satisfaction, already imagining numbers, commissions, outcomes. Everything in the room shifted for them in that instant. To them, the house had just changed ownership. To me, nothing had changed at all. Derek smiled as he gathered the documents, tapping them once against the table to straighten the edges. "Good," he said, as if we had simply agreed on dinner plans rather than the end of my life as I knew it. "Meadowbrook will be easier for you, Mum. No stress, no maintenance, just peace." Peace. He said it like I hadn't already built my life inside these walls, like peace was something I hadn't been living in for decades. Tiffany, who had stayed quiet until now, stepped forward and gently touched my shoulder. "We'll help you pack," she said softly, rehearsed kindness wrapped in careful tone. "It won't be overwhelming. We've already looked at timelines." Timelines, as if I was a schedule to be managed. I didn't respond. I simply nodded once, slowly, letting them believe what they wanted to believe. Because there is a kind of silence that people mistake for surrender, and I had learned long ago how powerful that mistake can be. They left within minutes after that. Derek kissed my cheek on the way out, quick and distracted, already mentally elsewhere. Craig Ellison followed with a polite nod, the way people do when they think a transaction is complete. Tiffany lingered a second longer at the door, as if she wanted to say something more, but thought better of it. Then they were gone. The house fell quiet again, but it was not the same quiet it had been before. That night I didn't sleep, not because I was afraid, but because my mind had already shifted into something sharper, something structured. I lay in the same bed Gerald and I had shared for decades, staring at the ceiling where a faint water stain still resembled a map of Florida. I used to trace it absent-mindedly when I couldn't sleep. That night I didn't look at it once. Instead, I thought about Derek's face, not the words he said, but the certainty behind them, that calm belief that I was already finished, already managed, already removed. He had made one mistake. He had assumed I was unprepared. I got up before sunrise, made coffee I didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table where everything had begun, the same table where he had slid those papers across to me, the same table that had seen birthdays, arguments, silence, grief. I opened a drawer and pulled out a yellow legal pad. I still use those. Old habits don't die easily. I started writing. First I called Patricia, my attorney, the same woman who had handled Gerald's estate years ago. Her voice was calm, professional, but the moment I explained what had happened, I heard the shift, that slight pause lawyers have when they recognize something that is no longer simple family tension, but structure, legal exposure. "Do not engage him further about ownership," she said carefully, "and do not sign anything else without review. I'll need to see everything." I wrote every instruction down. Then I began building a record. Every conversation, every visit, every suggestion Derek had made over the past year, downsizing, nursing home, maintenance concerns, Tiffany's remarks, the casual questions that weren't really questions. I wrote them all in detail, date and memory anchoring every line. Because memory without documentation is just a story, and stories can be rewritten. The third call was to my daughter Susan. She didn't need much explanation. She understood immediately. There was a long silence on the line after I finished speaking, and then she said one sentence that told me everything I needed to know about where she stood. "He didn't even ask me," she said quietly. That was all. By mid-morning I was no longer reacting, I was organizing. What Derek didn't know, what he had never bothered to ask, was that this house had not been in my name alone for years in the way he assumed. Gerald and I had structured everything carefully after retirement. Then, after his death, I had gone further, quiet, legal, deliberate steps that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with protection. A trust, properly structured, properly documented, properly invisible to anyone who never looked beyond assumption. Derek had never looked, and that, more than anything, was his mistake. I sat back in my chair and finally took a sip of coffee that had gone cold. Outside, the morning light was beginning to settle across Clover Hill Road, touching the same porch he thought he had already taken control of. He believed this was over, but for me, it had only just begun. When the house no longer feels like a home, but like a battlefield that has gone silent. I sat alone in the kitchen that night, under a dim yellow lamp, staring at the stack of papers in front of me, listening to the ticking clock on the wall like it was counting down something I could not yet see. My hands were steady, but inside everything felt stretched thin, like a wire pulled too tight. I had won no battle yet, but I had confirmed something far more important than victory. My son was no longer guessing. He was committed. Derek did not call me that night. He did not need to. Silence was his next move, and I recognized it too well.
He was building something in the background, a version of reality where I was no longer capable of making decisions, where concern replaced truth, and where sympathy would do the work that law could not be allowed to touch. Tiffany, I was certain, was helping him shape that version, smoothing the edges, making it sound reasonable, even loving. That is what made it dangerous. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. I wrote everything again, not because I had forgotten, but because repetition turns fear into structure. Every detail mattered now: the visit, the buyer, the signature, the exact words Derek used when he said he was selling my house. I documented it like I was building a second foundation under my life, one Derek could not see and could not touch. By mid-morning, I called Patricia again. Her voice was calm as always, but there was a sharper edge now. She told me we were no longer dealing with confusion or misunderstanding, we were dealing with misrepresentation. That word stayed with me longer than I expected. Misrepresentation sounds clean when lawyers say it, but when you hear it about your own child, it feels like something breaking in slow motion. Patricia instructed me to stop all verbal engagement with Derek unless it was documented. Everything had to move through record now, not emotion. She prepared the first formal notice, and I understood then that the situation had crossed a line I could not uncross. This was no longer about family disagreement, it was evidence. That afternoon, Susan arrived from Columbus without warning me first. She walked into the kitchen, placed her bag on the table, and said nothing for a full minute. She did not need explanations. She had already read enough in my face. Then she opened her folder and placed copies of trust documents beside mine, aligning them like pieces of a shield. For the first time since Gerald's death, I did not feel alone in my own home. We worked together in silence for hours, organizing everything into structure: dates, statements, copies, correspondence. Outside, the wind moved through the garden, shaking the last of the autumn leaves from the branches. Inside, the house began to transform from memory into record. That was the real shift, not emotion, not anger, structure. Later that evening, Derek sent a message. It was polite on the surface, almost warm, asking if we could talk properly as a family and suggesting I was being influenced by outside opinions. I read it twice, then placed the phone face down on the table. Susan did not react. She simply said, "He is testing where your silence breaks," and she was right. The next day, Patricia's letter went out. It was formal, precise, and unmistakably final in tone. It stated that the property was held under trust, that no sale was authorized, and that any attempt to proceed further would be considered interference with trust assets. When I read it, I did not feel relief, I felt exposure. Because once truth is written down in that way, it stops being private, it starts existing in the world. Derek's response came faster than expected. He did not call me, he did not write to Patricia, he arrived. His car stopped too sharply in the driveway that afternoon, tires biting into gravel like anger had weight. Tiffany was him again. They did not knock this time, they entered as if the conversation had already been decided. I remember standing in the doorway, realizing how quickly a home can start to feel like contested ground. What followed was not a discussion, it was pressure. Derek spoke about practicality, about aging, about responsibility, about how difficult it is for children to watch their parents refuse help. Tiffany added softness to his words, wrapping control in concern. They both spoke as if I were already somewhere else mentally, as if they were only trying to bring me back. But I was not lost, I was listening. When they finished, I told them only one thing, that everything now had to go through Patricia, no exceptions, no private conversations. Derek's expression changed then, not into anger immediately, but into something colder, calculation. That was the moment I understood he was no longer trying to convince me, he was preparing to replace me. After they left, the house felt heavier, like the air itself had absorbed what had been said. That evening, Susan called and asked only one question: "Are you ready for what comes next?" I did not answer immediately, because readiness is not a feeling, it is a decision, and I was still making it. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the dark living room listening to the house settle around me, every small sound amplified: the creak of wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant passing of a car outside. Each sound reminded me that this place had always been alive, long before any of this began, and it would remain alive long after this conflict ended. By morning, something in me had changed, not softened, not hardened, clarified. I was no longer reacting to Derek, I was documenting him.
Derek didn't call that day, not immediately. That was the first sign something had shifted. He was confident, almost celebratory in the way people are after they believe they've closed a deal. But I knew that kind of confidence doesn't last long when reality starts testing it. I stayed in the house as usual, moving through it slowly, deliberately, listening to the familiar sounds, the creak of the staircase, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind brushing against the porch railing. Everything still belonged here. Nothing about it had changed, except the story Derek was trying to write over it. By the next morning, I had already taken the first real steps. Patricia moved quickly. She always did when she understood the seriousness of a situation. I met her at her office that afternoon, sitting across from her heavy wooden desk while she reviewed the papers Derek had brought into my home. She didn't need long. Lawyers rarely do when the truth is structured correctly on paper. "This is not a transfer of authority," she said finally, adjusting her glasses. "This is an assumption of authority he does not have." That sentence alone changed everything in the room. She leaned back slightly and continued, more precise now. "If he has already engaged a buyer under false authority, that creates exposure, not just for him, but for anyone relying on his representation." I didn't respond immediately. I just listened, because this wasn't new to me. What was new was the clarity of it being spoken aloud. Then she added something that stayed with me. "The important part now is control of narrative and documentation. You are no longer defending, you are establishing fact." Establishing fact. Not arguing, not pleading, not reacting. Establishing. I wrote that down. When I left her office, the world outside felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because I was no longer moving inside confusion. I was moving inside structure. That evening I called Susan again. She arrived the following day without hesitation. When she walked into the house, she didn't ask me if I was okay. She already knew the answer wasn't simple. Instead, she brought folders, organized, labeled, structured like she had been preparing for this moment without realizing it. We sat at the kitchen table where Derek had once laid those papers in front of me. Now it was covered in documents of a different kind. Trust papers, copies, notes, legal summaries. Susan highlighted sections with quiet focus, her expression tight but controlled. "He really thought you didn't have anything in place," she said finally, almost to herself. "He didn't think at all," I replied. That was the difference. By the third day, Patricia had sent a formal notice, not emotional, not aggressive, just precise. It outlined the legal structure of the trust, clarified my authority, and made one thing unmistakably clear. Derek had no standing to execute or negotiate any sale of the property. It wasn't a warning, it was a correction, and corrections have consequences. Derek showed up that same afternoon. This time he wasn't smiling. He came alone. I saw his car before he reached the door. The way he parked told me everything. Too fast, too sharp, no patience left in the movement. I stood in the hallway before he knocked, already steady, already prepared.
When I opened the door, he didn't greet me, he didn't even pretend. "What did you do?" he asked immediately. Not hello, not mum, just that. "What did you do?" I stepped aside and let him in. He walked through the living room like it no longer belonged to either of us. That was new. That was frustration replacing confidence. "I got a letter from your attorney," he said. "You've complicated everything." "I clarified everything," I replied calmly. He let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Mum, this was simple. It was supposed to be simple. You signed the papers." "I signed nothing that transfers ownership. You never had authority to sell it." That stopped him for a second, just long enough for doubt to enter. But doubt doesn't stay in people like Derek long. It turns quickly into anger. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, voice tightening. "Do you understand what this house is worth? Do you understand what you're sitting on?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I've known for years." That answer bothered him more than anything else, because it meant I had never been unaware. Tiffany arrived later that evening, uninvited this time. She didn't come in with warmth anymore. She came in with concern that had started to sound rehearsed. She spoke about stress, about confusion, about sometimes older people can be influenced by outside advice. It was subtle, carefully worded, but I recognized it immediately. It wasn't concern, it was a strategy. I let her speak. I let Derek speak. I let the entire argument unfold in front of me until there was nothing left but repetition. Then I said one sentence that changed the air in the room. "If you believe I am not competent," I said, looking directly at them, "then you can take that through legal process. But until then, you are not selling anything." Silence followed. Not peace, silence with weight. Derek stared at me like he was seeing something for the first time. Not a mother who was resisting him, but a mother who had already outmaneuvered him without raising her voice once all. And for the first time, I saw uncertainty in him. Not defeat, not yet, but the beginning of it, and that was enough for me to know this was no longer a negotiation, it was a collapse in progress.
By the time everything reached its final stage, the house on Clover Hill Road no longer felt like something that could be taken from me, not because the attempts had stopped, but because the truth had already taken root in ways that could not be reversed. What Derek had started as a simple assumption that I was alone, unprepared and easily managed, had slowly collapsed under the weight of something he had never accounted for, preparation that had been in place long before he ever made his move. Patricia called me one morning with a tone that was neither urgent nor calm, but final. "They've withdrawn everything," she said. "The listing, the buyer arrangements, all of it. The agency has formally disassociated from Derek's representation." I didn't speak right away, not because I was surprised, but because I was absorbing what it meant, not just legally, but personally. A story that had been pushed forward with such confidence was now being pulled back, line by line, until nothing remained except the record of what had been attempted. Susan was sitting at the kitchen table when I put the phone down. She didn't ask what had happened. She already knew by my expression. Instead, she simply exhaled and leaned back slightly, as if something she had been holding in place for weeks had finally settled. "So it's over," she said. "For now, because people like Derek don't always accept endings easily. They adapt, they rationalize, they rebuild their version of events, but the structure he needed to succeed was gone." That afternoon I walked through the house slowly, not out of fear and not out of relief, but out of recognition. The same staircase, the same light,
the same quiet rhythm that had existed long before any of this began. The third step still creaked under my weight. The kitchen still held the faint memory of every life that had passed through it. Nothing had changed physically, and yet everything felt reclaimed. Derek did not come that day, or the next. When he finally did appear again, it was different. No urgency, no force, just exhaustion. He stood at the door longer than usual before knocking, as if unsure whether he still had the right to enter at all. When I opened it, he looked older, not in years, but in certainty. That part of him that once walked into my home believing outcomes were already decided was no longer there in the same way. "I didn't know about the trust," he said, though even as he said it, there was hesitation behind the words. But I had already heard too many versions of that sentence to let it carry weight. "I didn't ask," I replied. Silence followed, not defensive silence, not angry silence, just emptiness where assumption used to be. Tiffany stood slightly behind him this time, no longer speaking first, no longer leading the tone of the conversation. She looked at the house differently now, not like something to be evaluated, but like something that had resisted being reduced to numbers. "We thought we were helping," she said quietly. That word again, helping. It had been used so often throughout this entire process that it had begun to lose meaning. I looked at both of them for a long moment, not with anger, not with victory, just clarity. Helping requires listening first, not deciding first. Neither of them responded, because there was nothing left in the script for that answer. They left not long after. This time there was no performance in the exit, no urgency, no confrontation waiting to happen, just the quiet discomfort of people who realized they no longer controlled the story they thought they were writing. After they left, I sat alone in the living room for a long time. The house was completely still, but it no longer felt like it was holding its breath. It felt like it was breathing again. In the weeks that followed, things settled in ways that were not dramatic but permanent. The legal record remained exactly as it should. The trust remained intact. The attempts to override it never returned. What did return, slowly and unevenly, was something closer to normal life. Susan visited more often, not out of obligation, but out of habit. We began cooking together again, small things at first, simple meals, conversations that didn't revolve around documents or conflict, just life returning to its quieter shape. The garden came back in spring, not all at once, but in pieces. Soil turned, seeds planted, tomatoes, beans, marigolds along the edges just like Gerald used to prefer. I remember standing there one morning, looking at the rows forming in the earth and realizing something simple. No one had taken anything from me. Not really. They had only tried, and that difference mattered more than I expected. Derek's presence in my life did not disappear completely, but it changed. It softened into distance, occasional messages, short calls, carefully worded conversations that avoided the past. Not forgiveness, not resolution, just space. And I understood something important in that silence. Not every ending arrives with clarity. Some arrive with absence. By the time summer returned, the house on Clover Hill Road was exactly what it had always been. Not a commodity, not a transaction, not a problem to be solved, just a home that had outlasted an attempt to redefine it. And I had outlasted it too. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. Because in the end, what I had learned was simple but unshakable. Power is not always in control. Sometimes it is in preparation, and sometimes It is in simply refusing to disappear when someone else decides you should.